there's an important contrast here between Jacob and Joseph. Because Jacob here, he looks at the circumstances and says, everything is against me. But years later, when God's plan is fully unfolded, Joseph looks back over the same events and says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter study through the book of Genesis. And last week we left off halfway through chapter 42. And throughout Joseph's timeline, we've used this visual just to trace God's work in his life, from the pit through the dark valleys of slavery, across barren deserts of prison after being falsely accused. And none of it was wasted. I mean, every hardship, every setback, every detour has brought Joseph to this moment in chapter 42, where he stands as the prime minister of Egypt. You might see my co-pilot back here. I have, here's Tinkerbell. But there's one final obstacle standing between Joseph and the fulfillment of God's dream for him. It's his family. And we've pictured that obstacle as a raging river. And that's actually why I'm out here today. Number one, it's too hot in Montrose to go for a walk like I usually do. But, you know, this is a lake, but it's actually the Uncompahgre River dammed up. And so, you know, this is a river. It's funny, in Colorado, we don't really have rivers. They're kind of glorified creeks. Where I'm from, the Columbia River, I mean, it's 2-3 miles across. And that reminds me of the river that we talked about last week, the Congo River, because it's wide. It's wide across, a mile across, but it has the largest rapids in the world. They're violent. And if we're really honest, I mean, family relationships, they can be just like these dangerous waters. Because old wounds, they run deep. You know, past hurts, you know, they don't disappear easily. And that's what makes the Congo River such a fitting picture. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but for centuries, the river was so vast and so powerful. It was also pretty muddy, so that scientists had no idea actually how deep the Congo River was. It actually wasn't until 2006 that a National Geographic expedition used professional kayakers and sonar equipment attached inside their kayaks, and what they discovered was astonishing. A massive trench running beneath much of the river, averaging 500 feet deep, and in some places it was plunging 700 feet, making the Congo by far the deepest river on earth. And doesn't that just kind of sound like family? You know, most of us, we actually have no idea how deep the wounds really go. I mean, years of painful words, betrayal, conflict, disappointment, regret, you know, hurts buried beneath the surface that continue to shape our relationships. Well, last week we learned something important, is that God, he builds bridges to heal broken families. And one of his primary bridge building tools, it's crisis. Well, crisis has a way of bringing even the most fractured families back together. But beneath the surface, there's something dangerously lurking. You know, something capable of destroying the very bridge that God's trying to build in families and between Joseph and his family. Now, that same thing is true of our families. Just when God begins creating a path towards healing, reconciliation, and restoration, an unseen enemy rises from below to attack that bridge and keep us trapped on opposite sides of the river. Well, to catch a glimpse of what this enemy looks like, I want you to look at this clip from Jeremy Wade of Hey, Tink. Tinkerbell just went for a swim. she's something lurking beneath the surface. I hope you like her mermaid life jacket. As he catches one of the most feared predators in the Congo River, the Goliath tigerfish.
Now, those teeth! That will just take lumps out of other fish. It will take lumps out of crocodiles even, and there are stories well documented of that taking lumps out of people. Wow. There we go. Oof. What a freshwater monster this thing is.
So, the predator here on this river is Tinkerbell in her mermaid life jacket. That's pretty cute. Oh, she's snuggling up now, so she's not too terrifying. But the predator beneath the surface of the Congo River, well, it's the Goliath tigerfish. And honestly, it makes me want to keep my feet out of the water here. But the predator lurking beneath the surface of family relationships, it isn't a prehistoric looking fish. It's something far more dangerous. It's bitterness. You know, bitterness is the enemy that attacks the bridges that God is trying to build. And it keeps family members trapped in old wounds and past failures and unresolved pain. And that's exactly what we'll discover happened as we continue through Genesis 42. The brothers they're actually standing on a bridge that God is building towards reconciliation, but they can't see it. Well, why? It's because bitterness. It's blinded them to what God is actually doing. But before we move forward, let's revisit the last couple of verses we studied together last time, because they provide the perfect reminder of where we left off and set the stage for what happens next. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in the sack." Well, last week we saw that Joseph's actions, they were actually motivated by grace. I mean, he returned his brothers' money. He paid for their journey home. But he's beginning to bless the men who had cursed him. But the brothers, they couldn't see it. Their trip to Egypt had stirred up emotions buried deep beneath the surface. Guilt and shame and regret. And shame has a way of twisting our perspective. Instead of seeing what God is doing, we become really self-focused and defensive. We begin interpreting acts of kindness as punishment and even as evidence of judgment. Well, the brothers, they were slaves to their shame and they're just terrified. Now, they all had already been accused of being spies by Joseph, but now they fear. They fear they're going to be accused of being thieves. And Simeon, he remained locked up in an Egyptian prison, and the only way to secure his release is to bring Benjamin back to Egypt. But they were convinced that their father, that he's never going to allow it. They knew how broken Jacob had become after last time one of his sons went with them, when Joseph went. And they knew that this bitterness, I'm sure you can see her tail, sorry. They knew the bitterness and grief that had settled into his soul. And that's the problem with bitterness, is that bitterness can cause us to act out of fear. It convinces us that our situation is just hopeless. And it blinds us to the fact that God, He's bigger than your family divide. And you might be thinking, yeah, but isn't Jacob now Israel? I mean, God renamed him and God transformed him after the wrestling match. Well, yeah, He did. But even people who have genuinely encountered God can still struggle with old wounds lurking beneath the surface. I mean, even mature believers, they can make irrational decisions when bitterness takes root. Well, verse 29. Then they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. So just think about what the rest of that journey must have been like. I mean, not just carrying the guilt and shame that was brought back up in their conversations, but trying to figure out how they're going to explain everything that happened to their dad. Because for weeks, they were walking back to Canaan with plenty of time to think, worry, and replay every moment of their encounter with Egypt's ruler. You know, how do we explain that Simeon is missing? He's not coming home with us. You know, how do we explain that we both have the grain, but also the money that we took with us to buy it? And how do we explain that the only way to rescue Simeon is to return to Egypt and bring Benjamin with us? And adding even more sting to the situation is this reality, is that Benjamin didn't come with them in the first place because their own father didn't trust them. I mean, think about that. More than 20 years had passed since they went away and Joseph didn't come back, since he disappeared. Yet, Jacob still wasn't willing to place Benjamin in their care. The wounds of the past were still shaping the relationships in the present, which reminds us that bitterness isn't the only predator lurking beneath the surface of family dynamics. Shame, it's there too. You know, it's just as powerful as bitterness. It's just as destructive. And it's capable of sabotaging reconciliation. Shame keeps us trapped in the past. It convinces us that we'll never be trusted again and never forgotten, never to be restored. And when shame takes hold, it blinds us to the bridges that God is building right in front of us. They told him all that had happened to them. Well, the last time these brothers came home missing a brother, they lied. They made up this story about Joseph having been killed by a wild animal and even used his blood-stained coat as evidence to support their deception. But this time, it's different. This time they come home missing a brother and they tell the truth. I mean, it's a small detail, but such an important one. For the first time, we begin seeing evidence that God has been softening their hearts. The men who once hid their sin, now choosing honesty. And that's where reconciliation begins. Even in your family, it begins with the truth. They said, "The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, we are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan." So yeah, they're finally telling the truth to their father about what happened in Egypt, but they're still repeating the biggest lie of all. I mean, for 20 years, they've told themselves that Joseph is gone, dead, never coming back. And at this point, maybe they truly believed it. Maybe they wanted to believe it. I mean, after repeating that lie for so long, it became the truth. It became the reality, even though it wasn't. And they were convinced their father could never know the actual truth. What they didn't realize is that Joseph, he wasn't dead at all. In fact, they had just bowed before him. The brother they thought was gone forever was alive and ruling over all of Egypt. The very person they feared most was actually the person that God was using to save them. You know, bitterness and shame, two deadly predators in families. This is what they do. They blind us to reality. They keep us trapped in old stories, unable to see what God is doing right in front of us. Well, verse 33. "The man who is Lord over the land said to us, 'This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me, and take food for your starving households, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land.'" What I find completely fascinating here is that Jacob, the father, he's absolutely, completely blind to what God is doing. His sons are simply describing what happened in Egypt. I mean, there's no indication that Jacob stops to just seek the Lord or pray or ask, God, What are you doing in this crisis? And yet we, hindsight is 2020, we can see it clearly. I mean, God's building a bridge. God is orchestrating a reconciliation, a reunion. And God is preparing to heal a family that's been broken for more than 20 years. But Jacob, he can't see it. He can't see any of it. Why? How does a man who once wrestled face to face with God all night get to this point? How does a man who trusted God with his life become so consumed by fear? And I think the answer is found in something Jacob said decades earlier when Joseph's blood-stained robe was brought to him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. And then we're told that Jacob, he mourned many days. His family tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And then he made a declaration that would shape the next 20 years of his life. I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. And notice what Jacob didn't say. He didn't say, I will grieve. He said, I will continue to mourn. In that moment, grief became his identity. And what began as painful loss, it slowly hardened into a way of life. For 20 years, Jacob allowed sorrow to occupy a space that only God was meant to fill. And now when God begins moving to restore what was lost, Jacob, he can't see it. That's what unchecked bitterness and prolonged despair and depression can do. They don't just steal our joy. They cloud our vision. They make us interpret every circumstance through the lens of loss instead of the lens of faith. And Jacob, he isn't seeing what God is doing because he's been staring at his pain for 20 years. I mean, bitterness, it's such a dangerous predator because it rarely attacks at once. Instead, it slowly eats away at our heart, at our joy, and our faith. And left unchecked, depression, it breeds anger. Anger towards others, anger towards our circumstances. And sometimes, and actually a lot of times, it builds into anger towards God. You know, over time, those roots, they grow deeper and deeper until bitterness, it begins to just control us. That grief that was once understandable has become the lens through which he sees everything. The bitterness and despair have grown such deep roots that they blind him to what God is doing right in front of him. Can you relate? I mean, I came across a description of depression from a Christian woman. Her name's Mary Keith, and I think this just captures it. Is that after getting married and starting a new job and moving across the country, she found herself sinking into depression. Listen to how she describes what it is. I was tired, really tired. I was edgy and emotional and anxious. I began noticing that I felt exactly like it looked outside, gray and miserable, numb. I sank further and further until finally breaking down one day at a work conference. I just couldn't go through the motions anymore. I felt like I was dying inside. And then she says something that may sound familiar to believers. I am a Christian, but the depression tempted me to distrust God. I was desperately seeking deliverance. He seemed to withhold it from me. I was completely blind to anything he was trying to do. And she found herself asking questions like, why won't you lift me out of this pit? Aren't you a deliverer? Why do the voices of despair sound so much louder than yours, God? Well, that's where Jacob is. I mean, he's not an unbeliever. He's a man who has walked with God his whole life. A man who wrestled with God. A man whose name was changed by God. So which is why the author of Hebrews, he gives us this warning. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. A bitter root. Can you relate? You know, I found this photo of a baby Goliath tigerfish. Look closely. Look at its teeth. It already has almost translucent, yet razor-sharp teeth that'll one day make it one of the most feared predators in the Congo. Well, right now, it's small. It just feeds on tiny fish and insects. It doesn't look at all threatening. Well, that's how bitterness, that's how it begins. It's small. It's a disappointment, a wound, a sense of depression, anxiety, shame, unresolved grief. But if left unchecked, it keeps feeding. It keeps growing larger and stronger. And what once seemed manageable slowly grows into a predator, a monster that dominates our thinking, poisons our relationships, and blinds us to what God is actually doing. Eventually, that tiny fish becomes a full-grown Goliath tigerfish. And what started as pain, it becomes a bitter root, ready to attack every bridge of reconciliation God's trying to build. Verse 35, as they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Well, we already know that one of the brothers, we know he discovered his money in his sack on the journey home. But now, standing before their father, every one of them, the rest of the brothers, discover that money has been returned. And it wasn't by accident. God wanted Jacob to see that surprise too. The brothers, they're completely confused. I mean, shame, anxiety, and fear, they're all swirling together. They feel out of control. They're afraid of being accused. I mean, after losing Simeon, afraid of what this mysterious ruler in Egypt might do next. And now Jacob is finally brought up to speed on the full weight of the crisis. But Jacob, he's saturated with bitterness. So instead of responding as a man of faith, of going to God, he reacts as a man of fear. Rather than asking, God, what might you be doing here? He immediately assumes worst case scenario. And worst case scenario is a big sign of bitterness. I mean, bitterness blinded him to any possibility that God is working behind the scenes. All he can see is loss, danger, and another reason to be afraid. But verse 36, their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin?" Boom. There it is. The old tigerfish of bitterness rears its ugly teeth. 20 years of suspicious glances. 20 years of depression and mourning. 20 years of anger, blame, and unanswered questions. All of it comes spewing out in a single moment of rage. First, Joseph is gone. Now Simeon is gone. And it's all because of you. He can't prove it. He has no evidence. But deep down, he suspected these sons ever since Joseph disappeared. And now, they're asking him to trust him with Benjamin. Not a chance. I mean, bitterness has convinced Jacob that everyone is against him. Everything is falling apart, and no one can be trusted. Instead of seeing God's hand at work, all he can see is another threat, another loss, another reason to hold on tighter. And that's what bitterness does. It turns every crisis into confirmation that our worst fears are true. Then Jacob makes one of the saddest statements in all of Genesis, if not all of the Old Testament. Everything is against me. Oh! In that one sentence, Jacob reveals what 20 years of grief, depression, and flat-out bitterness have done to them. Everything is against me. He has no joy in the present and no hope for the future. His pain has become the lens through which he sees life. But Jacob, don't you remember what God said at Bethel? Remember this? I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. The tragedy is that Jacob couldn't have been more wrong. Everything was not against him. God was preserving food during a famine. God was protecting Benjamin. God was preparing Joseph. God was restoring a broken family. God was fulfilling His promises. The very things that Jacob saw as evidence that God had abandoned him were actually proof that God was working behind the scenes. And now Jacob had every reason to grieve. But somewhere along the way, he stopped defining his life by God's promises and began to start defining it by his loss. There's an important contrast here between Jacob and Joseph. Because Jacob here, he looks at the circumstances and says, everything is against me. But years later, when God's plan is fully unfolded, Joseph looks back over the same events and says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So think about that. Same family, same losses, same trials, the same exact story, yet two completely different perspectives. Jacob saw only what people were doing to him. Joseph saw what God was doing through it all. And that wasn't just a final statement from Joseph. That's how he lived in slavery. That's how he lived in the prison. He didn't live in bitterness. He lived with integrity and faith that God was still in control. Jacob, his father's belief that everything is against me, kept him trapped in a dark valley of depression, fear, and bitterness. Meanwhile, Joseph learned to trust that even when people meant evil, God was still at work for good. And that's a promise that we have, that Jacob was unable to see at that moment. It's what the Apostle Paul writes. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Notice that Paul doesn't say all things are good. He says that God works all things for good. That's why we don't have to become bitter. We can grieve. Grief is a good, God-ordained process. We can hurt. That's okay. And we can wrestle with loss. But we never have to conclude that everything is against us. Because the God who worked through Joseph's pit, slavery, and prison, and family betrayal is still working today. Bitterness says, everything is against me. Faith says, God is working even when I can't see it. Verse 37, then Reuben said to his father, you may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you, and trust him to my care, and I will bring him back. You can see just how desperate the situation has become. I mean, the brothers, they realize that Jacob has essentially given up on Simeon. I mean, as far as he's concerned, Simeon can spend the rest of his life in an Egyptian prison. He is not going to send Benjamin. And I can't help but wonder if Simeon's past played a role in that response. I mean, after all, Simeon, along with Levi, had brought shame upon the family through their massacre of the men at Shechem. And we can't know for certain, but it's interesting that Jacob seems far more concerned about Benjamin than his son who is sitting in a dungeon. Well, that's when Reuben steps forward. Remember, Reuben has a history of failure. I mean, as the firstborn, he disgraced himself by sleeping with his father's concubine. Yet he also was the brother who tried to save Joseph 20 years earlier. But perhaps the years of regret and shame, they've brought him to this moment. Determined to save Simeon and protect Benjamin, he offers the unthinkable. Reuben, he's willing to risk everything to make things right. But instead of hearing his son's plea, Look at Jacob's response. But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left." That's the only son that he has left that Rachel was the mother of, the wife that he loved. "If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down too in sorrow." You know, people, they often joke that old men can be stubborn and just set in their ways. And, you know, there's some truth to that. You know, but this is something completely deeper. This is a stubbornness of a man consumed by grief, fear, and 20 years of unresolved pain. A man who has lived under a lie for so long he could no longer see what God is doing. Well, Jacob refuses Reuben's offer outright, even though Reuben is essentially offering to lay down everything he has to save his brother. Bitterness has narrowed Jacob's vision until all he sees is the possibility of another loss. At this point, it's going to take an act of God to move this stubborn, old, wounded heart. And that's exactly what God is going to do. But guess what tool he's going to use to do it? It's the same tool that he often uses to break through our fear and expose our idols and draw us back to himself. Crisis. So as we close, let me just ask you a question. What predator has been leaking beneath the surface of your heart? For Jacob, it was bitterness. 20 years of grief and disappointment and depression had grown into something that completely blinded him to what God was doing. That God was restoring his family and God was fulfilling promises. God was answering prayers that Jacob had been praying, yet all he could see was loss. I know that some of you can relate. Maybe you've been wounded by your family. Maybe you've been carrying disappointment for years. Maybe you've been replaying an injustice, a betrayal, or a tragedy for so long. It's become the lens through which you view everything. Everything's against me. Wow. If you hear this, bitterness will always tell you that lie, that everything is against you. Faith says, God's working even when I can't see it. And the truth is, God never abandoned Jacob. And he's never abandoned you. In fact, the very crisis Jacob feared was the very tool God was using to heal his family and fulfill all the promises. Now, next week, we're going to discover that the famine, it's about to intensify. The crisis is going to grow far worse before it gets better. But God he's not losing control. He's tightening his grip. Because sometimes God allows the river to rise so we can finally cross the bridge he's been building all along.